They had already written his name in the report. Kia. Killed in action. Another number in a war that was eating men faster than anyone could count. But by morning, he was breathing. The field hospital lay 15 miles east of Tunis, crouched in the sand like a wounded animal. The night was thick with dust and the metallic scent of blood. Flies gathered on the canvas flaps. Inside, the air trembled with the low hum of generators and the slow rhythm of exhaustion. Scalpel trays clinked. Men moaned in fevered half-sleep. Dr. Joseph Maxwell hadn't slept in 30 hours. His eyes were red, his fingers raw under gloves that hadn't been changed in a day. He moved automatically now. Cut, clamp, stitch, move on, until they brought in the body. Shrapnel to the abdomen. The orderly said, voice shaking. The stretcher sagged under a young man's weight. His uniform was dark with dried blood, face pale to the color of ash. Dog tag. Wilson, James R., Sergeant, U.S. Army. 26 years old. Maxwell leaned close. Pulse, faint. Pupils, sluggish. Stench of infection thick as smoke. He knew the signs. Peritonitis. It was already too late. The senior surgeon, Colonel Hayes, took one look and muttered, "Even if we operate, he won't make it till dawn." Then he turned away, moving to the next cot. They laid Wilson on a table near the end of the tent. The lamp above him buzzed, swinging slightly in the desert wind. His breathing came in shallow bursts, lips cracked, eyes unfocused. A nurse, Grace Helton, adjusted the 4-line, her face calm but her hands trembling. "You should write to his mother," she whispered, barely audible under the noise of the camp. Maxwell didn't answer. He was staring at the man's stomach, at the angry swelling that pulsed with infection. Something inside him refused to accept the quiet finality of it. He had seen death too many times to still believe in miracles, and yet something gnawed at him. He stepped outside the tent. The night air was cold against his skin, heavy with smoke from burned-out trucks. Somewhere far off, artillery echoed like distant thunder. He looked toward the supply convoy parked by the ridge. Boxes, fuel drums, crates labeled with codes only quartermasters understood. Hours earlier, he'd helped unload one of those crates, a small wooden box marked medical, experimental use only. He remembered the sound it made when it cracked open. Inside, cushioned in straw, a single glass vial caught the moonlight. A pale golden liquid. Handwritten label, penicillin. He'd heard whispers about it from a British officer, a new mold serum, something that could fight infection itself. Only London had it, they said. Only a few drops in the world. Maxwell walked back into the tent, slower this time. Grace looked up at him, eyes red from the lantern glow. "You should rest," she said. "I can't," he replied. His voice came out flat, distant. He stood by Wilson's bed. The sergeant's pulse was fading now, a flutter beneath the skin, then a pause, then another. The thermometer read 105. Maxwell opened his kit. The ampoule lay in his hand, cool and almost luminous in the half-dark. He stared at the label. Experimental use only. He knew the protocol. No unauthorized substances. Court-martial. Prison. Worse, if the compound was toxic, it could kill the man instantly. But the alternative was certain death. Grace noticed what he held. "Joe, what is that?" He didn't look at her. "Something from the British convoy." "You're not serious." He swallowed. "What if it works?" For a moment, everything went quiet. No voices, no clatter, just the sound of the lantern's hiss and Wilson's shallow breaths. Grace shook her head. "If Hayes finds out." "He won't," Maxwell cut in. "Not until we know." His hands were steady as he filled the syringe. The liquid glowed faintly in the glass barrel. He cleaned the sergeant's arm, the skin waxy under the alcohol swab. The nurse turned away, whispering something like a prayer. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the tent walls. The lamp flickered once, twice. Then, the needle went in. A single drop. One injection. Maxwell withdrew the syringe, exhaled, and stared at the man's face, waiting for a sign. Nothing. Only the faint rattle of breath, the trembling of his own hand. He placed the vial back in his pocket, covered the soldier's body with a thin blanket, and sat down beside the cot. He didn't move for hours. The night grew colder. The distant guns fell silent. When dawn began to bleed into the tent, he was still there, eyes open, pulse in his throat, waiting to see whether he had saved a life or committed a crime. "Where are you watching from?" Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. At dawn, the man everyone had already buried asked for water. The first light came thin and gray through the canvas, spreading across rows of cots like a tide of ghosts. The diesel generator hadn't started yet, and the only sounds were the rustle of wind and the faint, rhythmic breathing of the wounded. Grace Helton pushed aside the tent flap and stepped inside, hugging her arms to her chest. The night chill still clung to the air, mixed with the sharp tang of alcohol and blood. She moved between bodies the way one walks through a cemetery, gently, not to disturb the dead. Her eyes were heavy from no sleep, her fingers stiff as she checked pulses and marked tags. 3 men had died before sunrise. Their sheets were pulled over their faces. She stopped at the last cot, the young sergeant from Kentucky, James Wilson. The lamp beside him had burned out sometime in the night. His skin looked dry, but his chest, she froze, it moved. Once, then again. She leaned closer, not trusting her eyes. Sergeant. His lips parted, cracked and pale. Water, he rasped. Barely sound, more breath than voice. The tin cup in her hand trembled as she brought it to his mouth. He swallowed, slow and painful, but he swallowed. His pulse, strong enough to feel. His forehead, cooler. Grace dropped the cup, the clatter breaking the silence. Dr. Maxwell. Maxwell was outside, washing his hands in a basin of sand and disinfectant when he heard her. He ran in, boots slipping on the blood-soaked floor. For a moment he thought it was some cruel trick of exhaustion. Then he saw it himself, the man breathing. The thermometer slid beneath Wilson's arm. 99. His pulse, 78 and rising. The infection smell was gone. Grace's voice shook. How is this possible? Maxwell didn't answer. He just stared at the vial in his pocket, fingers brushing against the glass as if afraid to touch it. He'd expected nothing, not even hope. Yet here the man was, eyes half open, whispering for more water. Colonel Hayes stormed in moments later, called by the commotion. His face hardened when he saw the soldier sitting upright, blinking in the weak sunlight. He was dead, Hayes muttered. I signed the damn paper myself. No one spoke. The colonel's eyes narrowed. What did you do, Lieutenant? Maxwell met his gaze, but said nothing. His throat was dry, his heart pounding so loud it filled the tent. The colonel leaned closer, voice low and sharp. Answer me. I did what I could, Maxwell said finally. That's not an answer. The colonel ripped open the patient's chart, scanning it with disbelief. Septic shock, gangrene, 30% mortality? He should be gone. His tone dropped, suddenly wary. You didn't give him that British compound, did you? Grace glanced at Maxwell. The room seemed to shrink. No, sir, Maxwell lied. Hayes looked at him for a long time, then exhaled through his nose. Then this man's a miracle. Record it. Case 114. B. Unexpected recovery. He left, muttering something about divine intervention. The flap closed behind him, leaving only the hum of the waking camp. Grace turned to Maxwell, voice barely a whisper. You should tell him the truth. He shook his head. Not yet. Not until we understand. Over the next few hours, news of the resurrection spread across the base like wildfire. Orderlies came to see the man who had defied death. Even the chaplain stopped by, crossing himself in quiet awe. Wilson, still weak, tried to smile when they asked what he remembered. Nothing, he said. Just darkness, and then a voice. Maxwell didn't ask whose voice. He was too busy writing notes. Temperature curves, wound color, appetite returning. Every sign pointed to one impossible conclusion. The infection was gone. Not reduced. Not controlled. Gone. By afternoon, the hospital was alive with rumors. Some said Wilson had been misdiagnosed. Others whispered about secret drugs from London. Maxwell kept his head down, eyes on his charts, while inside his mind a storm brewed. What if it wasn't luck? What if that single injection could have saved dozens, hundreds, if only they'd had it sooner? That night, after the day's chaos had finally subsided, he walked back to Wilson's cot. The sergeant was sleeping now, color back in his cheeks, breath slow and even. The sight filled Maxwell with a strange mix of triumph and dread. Grace stood behind him, voice soft. He's going to live. Yeah, Maxwell said quietly. He's going to live. He looked at his hand, the one that held the syringe. But at what cost? She frowned. What do you mean? He didn't answer. His eyes drifted toward the supply crate outside the tent, the one marked experimental use only. Inside it, he knew, were a few more vials. And somewhere above his head, command lines were already buzzing with reports and questions he couldn't yet imagine. A jeep engine roared in the distance. A messenger ran toward the camp, waving papers. Orders. Always new orders. By the time the generator flickered back to life, casting harsh yellow light across the tent, Maxwell already sensed it. The world had just changed. A week later, Sergeant Wilson was standing on his own feet, grinning like a man reborn. But the brass wanted answers. And answers, in wartime, were never just about medicine. He wasn't supposed to use it. No one outside London even knew it existed. The orders came folded in a thin brown envelope, stamped confidential. The summons was short, cold, and final. Lieutenant Joseph Maxwell, report to Medical Corps Headquarters, Algiers. No reason given. No congratulations either. Just silence and protocol. The morning he left the field hospital, Sergeant Wilson stood at attention, still weak but smiling, the desert wind tugging at his bandages. "You saved my life, Doc," he said quietly. Maxwell just nodded, unable to meet his eyes, because he knew what might come next. Algiers was a different world, the heat polished by sea wind, the white walls of the city shining like bone. The headquarters building, once a French hotel, now smelled of disinfectant and tobacco. Inside, the corridors echoed with boots and typewriters. They led him into a small office on the top floor. Behind the desk sat Colonel Hayes, the same man who declared Wilson a miracle. But now his tone was stripped of wonder. "Sit down, Lieutenant." On the desk lay a single report, Maxwell's handwriting, his charts, his notes. And next to it, a glass vial identical to the one he'd used. "Where did you get this?" Hayes asked. "From a convoy crate, sir. It wasn't labeled for disposal." "Source?" "I don't know." Hayes opened a folder, slid out a document marked 42P, Experimental Penicillin Trials. He read aloud, slow and deliberate. "Shipment of 4 vials intended for research team under Major Fleming, destination Algiers. Missing in transit. Restricted to authorized personnel only." His gaze sharpened. "Do you realize you administered a classified substance without clearance?" Maxwell hesitated. "Sir, it saved a man's life. It could have killed him." The colonel's voice cracked through the room. "You don't gamble with human experiments in my hospital." A pause. Only the ticking fan filled the space. Hayes leaned forward, softer now, but deadlier. "You wrote here that the infection reversed within 12 hours. Temperature normalized in 16. There's not a single medical precedent for that. Do you stand by this?" "Yes, sir." "Then you understand what that means." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Hayes pushed the file away, rubbing his temple. "God help us. If this is real, it changes everything. Surgery, amputations, the mortality curve itself. You may have stumbled onto the cure that London's been chasing for years." He looked up. "But if command hears you used it without authorization, they'll strip your rank and bury the report before it leaves this office." That night, Maxwell couldn't sleep. From his window, the port shimmered with distant lights. Ships groaned against the docks, unloading crates of morphine, bandages, morphing into ghosts of all the men they wouldn't save. He thought of Wilson, standing, breathing, laughing, and felt both pride and terror. He took the vial from his pocket, turning it under the lamp. Just a few drops of liquid left. Enough to remind him that he'd crossed a line. The next morning, a jeep waited outside. Hayes met him at the door, his face unreadable. "Orders from London," he said. "They're sending a research team. Until then, this stays between us. Understood?" "Yes, sir." "Good. Because if anyone asks, that man survived by God's grace, not by science." In the corridor, Maxwell passed 2 officers whispering over telegraph cables. He caught fragments. Batch recall, contamination, reports from Tunis. The words slid like ice down his spine. Later that day, a messenger delivered a sealed note to his quarters. It had no signature, just a single line typed in black ink. "You're not the only one who used it." He stared at the message until the letters blurred. If others had injected the serum, without proper control, without dosage limits, then anything could happen. Infection cured, yes, but at what cost? By evening, a dispatch arrived from the Southern Front. Unexplained fevers among patients treated with compound 42P. Some improved miraculously. Others died within hours. London demanded samples. Algiers demanded silence. Maxwell sat at his desk, the telegram crumpled in his fist. Outside, the sea crashed against the breakwater, relentless and cold. He realized the truth he didn't want to face. This wasn't just a medical breakthrough. It was a weapon in the making. In the dim light of the barracks, he opened his journal and began to write. March 27, 1943. I no longer know whether I saved a man's life or began something we'll all regret. He closed the book and listened to the hum of the generators below, their rhythm steady as a heartbeat. Somewhere in the city, a phone rang, and a voice answered in clipped British tones. A new order was already forming, and with it, a new secret. For every vial that saved a man, 10 others had to die waiting. By late spring of 43, hospitals stretched from Tunis to the edge of Sicily like scattered ribs of a dying beast. The war was moving north, but death refused to retreat. The penicillin came by air, small silver thermos flasks dropped on airstrips at dawn, packed in ice that melted before noon. 6 ampoules here, 5 there. Each one could turn a fevered corpse into a living man, or vanish in a single mistake of choice. The order was clear, typed in the calm brutality of headquarters English. Administer at discretion. Priority, high-value personnel. No names of privates, no men without rank. Maxwell read it twice, folded it back, and felt the paper cut his thumb. That afternoon, 2 stretchers arrived side by side. On one, Captain Harris, liaison officer, 38, father of 2, a bullet through his abdomen already darkening the gauze. On the other, a 19-year-old private from Kansas, same wound, same fever. Harris was essential. The boy was just another uniform. Whose life is worth more, doctor? Asked the major, voice dry, not cruel. He already knew the answer. Maxwell looked at them both. The captain's chest rose in shallow gasps. The private's eyes stared at the canvas ceiling, already drifting somewhere far from this heat. His hand found the ampoule in his pocket. Cool glass. Liquid gold. He hesitated, then laid the syringe on the table. Across from him, the Scottish surgeon lit a cigarette with a shaking hand. Science gives us miracles, he said, exhaling. And war decides who deserves them. Maxwell didn't speak. The tent was so quiet he could hear the hum of flies. Finally, he picked up the syringe again. He injected the captain. The private got morphine and a hand on his shoulder. That night Maxwell wrote in his journal, every injection feels like playing God. Every refusal feels like murder. Weeks passed. The desert baked to dust, the sea turned restless blue, and the hospitals kept moving. Tunis, Sousse, Licata, then the broken hills of Sicily. Penicillin shipments came late, sometimes never. One batch arrived packed in a crate of peaches, another was stolen and returned, one vial missing. Rumors said an orderly traded it for whiskey and a ride home. The British research team lectured the doctors about dosage, purity, and fermentation capacity, as if numbers could comfort dying men. Maxwell nodded, but he only saw faces. Wilson's among them, the first man he'd saved without permission. The miracle that started all this. In Jela, he broke protocol. 2 soldiers came in, both septic, both doomed. One was an engineer marked priority. The other, a farm kid with a letter to his mother folded in his pocket. Maxwell split the dose. Half each. The engineer lived. The boy lasted 2 days longer than expected. Long enough to say, Doc, if you can't save me, just make it worth it. Maxwell never wrote that line down, but it lived under his skin. The shortage grew worse as the Allies pushed into Italy. Reports said the factories in America were still struggling to produce enough mold, the vats too small, the yields too thin. In the field, the doctors learned to ration miracles. 1 injection per man. 2 only if he was critical to operations. The system crept into their blood like guilt. Orderlies whispered bets on who would get the next dose. Chaplains quoted scripture about loaves and fishes. Nurses kept their faces still, but Maxwell saw the fatigue in their eyes. Every time the thermos arrived, a crowd formed before he even opened it. Men watched him like he was about to pull life itself from the ice. In Calabria, a colonel took the last vial by force, waving a pistol while blood leaked through his bandages. "You think my command ends because I'm bleeding?" he shouted. He got the injection. He died anyway. The nurse who'd begged Maxwell to use it on another man wept silently while she cleaned the body. In his next report, Maxwell crossed out half the lines before signing it. He wrote only one clear sentence: "To choose who lives is to lose a part of yourself each time." By autumn, penicillin was being called the miracle mold. Newspapers in London hinted at secret allied medicine that defied infection. Commanders sent coded requests. Politicians sent praise. None of them had seen the tents, the sand, the small deaths that never made the lists. Then came the rumor. At first it was just a whisper in the ward at Naples. A soldier who had been declared terminal, treated once, and somehow walked out 2 days later. But there was something wrong with him. He didn't sleep. He didn't bleed when he cut himself shaving. He stared too long at things no one else saw. An orderly swore the man's stitches had vanished overnight, skin smooth as glass. Another said he never ate, never felt pain. Maxwell heard the talk and tried to dismiss it as exhaustion's fantasy. But the name in the report stopped his breath. J.R.W. He knew those initials. Grace found him sitting outside the tent that evening, pen frozen above a blank page. "Another case?" she asked. He nodded. "A man who won't die." She frowned. "You mean can't?" "I don't know anymore." He closed his notebook and stared toward the fading horizon, the sea reflecting the last light of day like a blade. The air smelled of salt, blood, and something he couldn't name, something colder than either. When the jeep came next morning with the orders from headquarters, he didn't need to read the paper to know where he was going. The seal said Naples. The file said Case J.R.W. Grace watched him pack. Neither spoke. When he stepped into the sunlight, the camp went quiet around him, as if even the war paused to listen. And somewhere between the tents and the runway, the whisper kept spreading, about a cure that worked too well, and a soldier who should have died, but didn't. He came back to thank the man who saved him, and the man wished he hadn't. The British hospital in Naples had once been a convent. Its walls still held the faint echo of hymns, though now the air smelled of ether, damp stone, and iodine. Rain slicked the courtyard, and stretchers rattled down the halls like prayers said too late. Maxwell arrived just after dawn, carrying a folder with the initials J.R.W. He already knew who it was before he opened the door. James Wilson sat near the window, wrapped in a wool blanket, sunlight crawling over his hands. He looked alive in a way that wasn't quite human, skin too smooth, eyes too bright. When he saw Maxwell, his face broke into a grin that didn't belong to a man who'd once been buried in reports as Kia. "Doc," he said, gripping Maxwell's hand, firm, warm. "They told me you'd come. I wanted to thank you." The scar that should have run down his stomach, the mark of war and miracle both, was gone. The skin there was unbroken, pale as wax. Maxwell stared too long. "Any pain?" he asked. Wilson shook his head. "Not since Tunis. Nothing hurts anymore. Not even when it should." He laughed softly, but the sound was hollow. The nurses called him the man who beat death. Visitors whispered his name like a secret. A photographer came from London. The flash lit up the room. When Wilson lifted his shirt for the picture, no one spoke. Even the camera seemed to hesitate. Maxwell took blood samples, set them under the microscope. The cells looked wrong, too quick, too clean. They multiplied like they had somewhere to be. Cultures that should have taken days grew overnight. The data was perfect in the way that made it frightening. He wrote in his notes, "Immune system hyperregenerative. Subject unresponsive to pain stimuli. No infection, no inflammation." Then, almost against his will, what did we change when we saved him? Wilson was cooperative, polite, even gentle. He helped the nurses carry stretchers, fixed broken radios, walked in the rain without a coat. He didn't get tired, didn't shiver, didn't bleed when he nicked his hand on a wire. They called it divine grace. Maxwell called it something else. One evening, under the yellow light of the mess tent, a British doctor murmured, "We asked for a miracle, and the mold gave it to us. But it doesn't know the difference between healing and rewriting." Wilson didn't seem to notice the whispers. When Maxwell asked about nightmares, he just smiled faintly. "I don't have them," he said. "It's like the part of me that remembers pain got left behind. And home." Maxwell pressed. Wilson's eyes went distant. "Home feels like something that happened to someone else. I remember it, but I don't feel it." That night, Maxwell sat alone in the lab. The rain tapped against the window. His notes filled page after page, each line bleeding into the next until the words blurred. We cured infection. But what else did we alter? He wrote it twice, then crossed it out. When he passed through Ward C before dawn, Wilson was sitting upright, eyes open, watching the wall as if waiting for something behind it to move. Maxwell almost spoke, but the soldier turned his head and said quietly, "Doc, you did the right thing." Then he smiled again, that same calm, unnatural smile, and closed his eyes. By morning, the newspapers had found him. "The Miracle of Naples," one headline read. A colonel arrived with a reporter, demanding a photo for morale. Wilson obeyed, shaking hands and posing beside the flag. Maxwell stood at the edge of the frame, silent, as flashbulbs exploded like tiny grenades. After that, things grew stranger. Wilson volunteered for everything: blood drives, cleanup, even burial details. He worked through the night, never slowing. He said he didn't need sleep. When fever swept through the ward, he tended the sick and never fell ill. A psychiatrist interviewed him and wrote, "Affect blunted. No emotional distress. Memory intact, empathy uncertain." Maxwell reread the report and added in his own handwriting, "Healed physically, yes, but something essential is missing." He tried to reach him anyway. One afternoon, under the pale winter sun, he asked, "James, when you think of the war, what do you feel?" Wilson looked at him, calm and almost kind. "Nothing. Not even the remembering hurts." That line stayed with Maxwell all evening. It repeated in his head as he extinguished the lamp, leaving the ward in shadow. The silence felt like judgment. A week later, the cot in Ward C was empty. Wilson had signed himself out. No destination listed. The nurses assumed he'd been reassigned. Maxwell didn't believe it. For days later, a patrol brought news. A burned convoy found south of Caserta, trucks twisted into black skeletons. Dozens dead, except one. They found him sitting on a wall, clothes torn but skin untouched, staring at the wreckage as if it were a photograph. He didn't speak when they approached. His pulse was steady, his eyes clear. Around him, the ground was littered with bodies. He was the only one alive. Back in Naples, he told Maxwell he didn't remember anything. "I woke up, and everyone was gone," he said. "Maybe I was supposed to go with them. Maybe I forgot how." Maxwell reached for his shoulder. Wilson flinched, the first reaction of pain in months, then smiled, small and empty. "Do you believe me, Doc?" Before Maxwell could answer, the generator died. The ward fell into blackness, broken only by the sound of rain. By morning, Wilson was gone again. They tracked footprints north for half a mile before they vanished into the mud. Beyond that, nothing, just the echo of one impossible life still walking, somewhere between miracle and mistake. They called it the greatest discovery of the century. But in every hospital, a doctor whispered, "Don't forget what it cost." By 1944, penicillin had become legend. Factories in Peoria, Brooklyn, and London ran day and night, their chimneys breathing hope. Crates marked the wonder drug lined the docks. Newspapers showed smiling nurses, healed soldiers, and headlines that spoke of science defeating death. The smell of rot was gone from the wards. But Joseph Maxwell couldn't celebrate. He was home now at Fort Dix. Snow pressed against the windows, muting the world. In the corridors, he heard laughter instead of groans. Men who would have died in Africa now argued about baseball. The drug worked. Too well, maybe. Each smile reminded him of the faces that hadn't made it. And one that had, but came back wrong. He lectured to young doctors, clean coats, shining eyes. He explained doses, reactions, purity levels. When the applause came, he said quietly, "We learned to save the body. Now we have to remember how to heal the soul." The room fell silent. No one wrote that down. Some nights, he walked alone past the storage wing where the vials sat behind glass, cold and humming. He'd touch the pocket of his coat where the empty ampoule still rested, the one he'd stolen from a crate under desert moonlight. He could still see Wilson's face that night, the faint rise of his chest after the injection, the whisper, "Water." A letter arrived from Grace Helton in May 1945. She was in France, working with refugees. "They use it everywhere now," she wrote. "Children who would have died last winter are running again. You gave them that. Don't regret it, Joe." He read it by the window, the snow melting on the glass. His reply was short. "Sometimes I think life is heavier than death." When the war ended, they gathered in Washington to celebrate the scientists and doctors who had turned the tide. Generals called penicillin the weapon of mercy. Cameras flashed. Maxwell stood at the edge of the crowd. He clapped because that was what the moment required, but his hands felt empty. Back in his quarters, he opened the small box he'd carried since Africa. Inside, his field journal, sand-stained and worn. The last line read, "He was supposed to die? He didn't. I still don't know what that means." He turned a blank page and wrote slowly, each letter deliberate. War showed us how fragile life is. Science showed us how powerful mercy can be. He closed the book and listened to the faint hum of the bass, the world learning how to breathe again. Outside, dawn crept pale over the snow. They said penicillin had already saved 1 million lives. Soon it would be millions more, farmers, children, mothers. Hope mass-produced. Factories called it progress. The papers called it victory. Maxwell called it a question that would never stop asking itself. He took the vial from the box. The glass was cloudy, the label faded. Penicillin, experimental use only. He turned it between his fingers, the weight smaller than memory, heavier than regret. "We did what we could," he whispered. The sunlight touched his desk, and for a moment, everything was still. No gunfire, no sand, no cries. Only the soft, breathing quiet of a world that had survived itself. No one around him knew that the first time this drug was used, it wasn't in a lab or a city hospital. It was in a field tint beneath foreign stars, surrounded by dust and fear. No one knew a young doctor had broken orders that night just to give one dying man a chance to see the morning. History would count the millions saved. It would not remember the sleepless eyes of the first man who used it, or the strange emptiness of the soldier who lived. Sometimes, in the quiet before sleep, Maxwell still heard Grace's voice. "You gave him life, Joe. Don't regret it." And he'd answer, softly, "I don't. I just wish I'd known what life meant that night." Penicillin would go on to save over 200 million souls. But that first night, in the desert silence, no one thought about science. They only hoped that someone, anyone, would live till morning.